thank you so much for being here this morning. I'm Barbara Miller, Director of the Institute for Global and International Studies at the Elliott School of International Affairs. This morning's event is the first Global Policy Forum of 2013. What a great way to start the year. The Global Policy Forum provides a platform for scholars, policymakers, and other international affairs leaders to discuss key global and international issues. I'm honored to be introducing two very distinguished public servants who will be speaking about anticipatory governance and some very practical ideas about how the U.S. government can upgrade itself to handle the distinct challenges of 21st century governance. First, Leon Fuerth, Research Professor of International Affairs and the founder and director of the Project on Forward Engagement. Professor Fuerth joined the Elliott School in 2001 after more than 3 decades of public service, including 12 years as a Foreign Service officer, 12 years on Capitol Hill, and 8 years in the White House as National Security Advisor to Vice President Al Gore. As the Vice President's National Security Advisor, Professor Fuerth sat on both the Principals and Deputies Committees of the National Security Council and the National Economic Council. He assisted the Vice President in establishing 5 binational commissions with Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Egypt, and South Africa. He was for 3 years the principal coordinator of the U.S. government's efforts to direct economic sanctions against the Milosevic regime in Serbia. He promoted efforts to develop the International Space Station with the Russians and was deeply involved in efforts to denuclearize former members of the Soviet bloc. In 2001, Professor Fuerth established the Project on Forward Engagement in the Elliott School to study how government can do a better and more systematic job of thinking about the future and to identify ways to improve the configuration of government to handle challenges that are ever more complex and interrelated. The outcome of his 12 years of teaching and research on this subject are found in the recently published report, Anticipatory Governance, Practical Upgrades, Equipping the Executive Branch to Cope with Increased Speed and Complexity of Major Challenges, and you're all welcome to picking up a copy, which are available out front. Well, we are also so honored to have with us this morning one of our nation's most experienced and accomplished diplomats, Ambassador Tom Pickering. Over his 5 decades of public service, Ambassador Pickering served as ambassador to Israel, Russia, El Salvador, Nigeria, and Jordan. He's also served as ambassador to the United Nations and as Under-Secretary of State for Political Affairs. Ambassador Pickering retired. Right, that's the joke part of this introduction. He retired in 2006 as Senior Vice President of International Relations for Boeing, and he's currently the Vice Chairman of Hills and Company. You may have recently heard his name in connection with the investigation co-chaired with Admiral Michael Mullen into the attack on the U.S. diplomatic mission in Benghazi. Over the last 2 years, Ambassador Pickering has made major contributions to Professor Fuerth's Anticipatory Governance report and the effort of Professor Fuerth to move these ideas into governance. We are thrilled to have him with us today to speak to the importance of this issue. Professor Fuerth will begin with a brief introduction of anticipatory governance, followed by remarks from Ambassador Pickering. Then we will have responses from one of them to the other, followed by questions from you. The event is on the record, and it is being audio and video recorded. This is, I think you will agree, an excellent way to kick off a rainy Monday and an important week, and to help us all think more intelligently and practically about our long-term future. Please join me in welcoming Professor Fuerth and Ambassador Pickering.
I've been told to keep this to 20 minutes or else. And every time my associate sees me writing on it, he's assuming that I'm adding to it, but no, I've been editing. I see a lot of old friends around the room. I hope that I have recognized you in time to greet you I'm going to conserve time by not reading lists of names here, but to thank you for coming out and to thank everybody in this audience for coming out on what I think of as a nasty, nasty day, especially if you're doing commuter traffic in Northern Virginia. Let me begin right away. I want to end with enough time to thank some people and then turn it over to Tom. This all began with my perception that things were accelerating. I have enough objectivity to realize that there were at least two possible explanations for that perception. One of them is that they really were accelerating. The other one is that I was slowing down and they were proceeding at their normal pace. I've spent a lot of time trying to examine the case for whether or not they're accelerating. I don't have to examine the case for whether I'm slowing down. My wife makes that point frequently. My theory is that objectively, major and dislocating events are increasing in frequency, and that the reason for this, believe it or not, is Moore's law. Since the internet and since computational speed undergird the tremendous rate of technological change that we've been experiencing, and since that rate of technological change is the point of origin of tremendous stresses on the social order as it once was, I think it's fair to say that there is a kind of equation out there that says societal stress is a function of bandwidth, and we're experiencing it. Certainly, the past decade has been a case study in acceleration and in strategic surprise. I'm just going to tick them off. September 11th and everything that followed from that, the unintended consequences of the United States invasion of Iraq and displacement of Saddam Hussein, an event like Hurricane Katrina and now Sandy, the financial crisis of 2008, the inversion of economic power to Asia, which seems somehow to have compacted the events of a century into the events of a decade or two, the Arab Spring. Now, it is possible that all of these events are black swans, a who could have thunk it type of historical surprise. But it is also possible that we have been surprised because we have not been tuned to hints of what might happen and have not been focused on the contingencies that subsequently became realities. Personally, I'm of the latter school, but that's a longer discussion. I do want to say that these are relatively short, sharp shocks with long-term consequences. In addition to them, I think that there are certain thematics that need to be observed when thinking about change of this kind. And I group them as follows. Yeah, I'm wondering where the music is coming from also. Right. One of them is environmental dislocation. Considering for whom I worked, not surprising that I would have from the beginning, focused on evidence of that change. The other one is geopolitical inversion. One second. Someone bring the hammer. Thank you very much. You're fortunate it wasn't at Carnegie Hall. They might have mobbed you. The other one, as I said, is geopolitical inversion. We're seeing it. And then there's a third category that I think is more interesting perhaps than some of the others. I call it evolutionary secession. It is the rapid transition that our species is making from one that has been shaped by evolutionary forces to one that has become an evolutionary force of its own, an unguided force, but nevertheless an unguided force. Now, the point of all that is that surprises and crises like the Arab Spring and so on will happen. And in many cases, we're going to be able to deal with them adroitly, if belatedly. But a defensive game is ultimately a losing game. And our objective has to be to figure out how to run our part of this game with history in a fashion that allows us to keep pace, in other words, to anticipate and to respond in a timely way. Now, to do this, government must be upgraded, and that's the subject of this report. I'd like to just backtrack a moment in time to explain to you how it came into being as a process. It started as an effort in 2011. I assembled groups of highly qualified and senior volunteers, all off the record, and we formed working groups and began to review various concepts of how to accelerate the ability of government to recognize change and to deal with it. We applied certain screening requirements to the ideas that we reviewed, and they were very simple: no demand for new resources, no new legislation required, but relied on presidential authority and existing law. It was the only way that we could figure out to get change started rather than to begin to debate at length about what change to start. Now, subsequently, these ideas, which have been formed into that report, have been endorsed by many of the most experienced minds in this city and elsewhere. You can find a list of them on page 3 of the book. That's Roman 3 of the book. Now, these ideas boil down to a concept which I've called anticipatory governance. Anticipatory governance is a way to bring government up to pace with problems that are complex in their form of organization. By complexity, I mean that they do not behave the ordinary laws of linearity that we're trained to think about from childhood up. They represent discontinuity, they represent surprise, they represent unintended consequences. The report on anticipatory governance argues that it is possible to deal with a complex policy universe by combining 3 systems in government. Systems that would provide for a closer linkage between foresight, between elements of government through networking, and would provide a tracking mechanism, or what I call feedback, to help adjust to the need for change. I want to discuss each of these briefly in turn. On the subject of foresight. Foresight is very often conflated with prophecy. It's not. Prophecy is a point prediction. It says something of a certain type is going to happen in a certain time in a certain place. There are plenty of bleached bones of prophecies. Every once in a while one turns out to be right. Every once in a while an individual comes along who really does appear to have had prophetic insight. Okay, but governments can't depend upon finding people who have prophetic insight. They need process in order to simply increase the probability that they will get wise about what's coming. So my definition of foresight is that it is about scanning the horizon for major upcoming events, imagining and planning alternative approaches, and then plugging those into a policy process in the hope of shaping responses to long-range possibilities when they are just possibilities and when they are still in the longer range. Foresight, above all, needs to be actionable. It needs to be tied to today's decisions, and it needs to be sensitive to long-range implications even of current decision-making, and to the forces that are driving events in the present and may be driving it in the future. Now, the study is organized in this fashion. It has 3 sections: foresight, networking, and the feedback. And each one identifies a suite of possible actions that can be taken at the executive level in our government for the purpose of upgrading the capacity to perform in these areas. So, to summarize, on foresight, here are some of the things you can do. You can instruct key staff members of principal officers to collect foresight data from existing sources and to make it part of the information stream that comes across their desks. You can use the entity in our government called the Deputies Committee, which is all the number 2 people in the executive branch agencies, to serve as a place where the deputies' very concentrated knowledge of what is going on in their agencies and their awareness of national policy can be brought together and made tangent to streams of information about the longer-term future. You can use existing strategy offices around government, and especially at the White House level in the national security staff and the policy planning strategy offices in government to bring together disciplined foresight analysis. This would be an improvement over the way these offices are generally used now, which is to operate essentially within narrow silos and not to be very well interlinked. You could create new incentives for civil servants to look at long-range implications here, and you could educate the civil service as part of their career pattern to be familiar with these methods. There is presently one major example of how this can be done that I know of in the world, and that's Singapore's horizon scanning and risk assessment program. Singapore is a tiny state physically, but it punches above its weight, well above its weight, and it has instituted, now going on possibly for a decade, a systematic method to do these things with its senior civil servants. We do similar things with our senior military officers, but we do not do these things with our senior civil servants, at least not yet. We move on to the subject of networking. The idea of networking is to achieve greater coherence from the impact of the resources that we bring to bear through policy. It involves flattening hierarchies. It involves using the intent of the commander or the senior officer to guide more spontaneous behavior on the part of lower levels of the organization. It means managing to mission as opposed to managing to jurisdiction. It means budgeting to mission as opposed to budgeting by jurisdiction. There are some very specific ways to encourage this. You can synchronize the national strategy reports, which are now issued as a matter of law, so that they appear instead of as a scattered set of events on the calendar as a linked series or a cascade of reports connecting one element of federal policy to the next. You can create and use a super calendar that lays out knowable events in sequence. You can create teams of officials who are focused on mission as opposed to jurisdiction. And in particular, you could start to use subgroups within the cabinet for this kind of purpose. You can use interagency coordinators, who unfortunately became known as czars early on in this administration. And you could begin to conduct strategic budgeting. That is, figure out how much money it costs to reach alternative outcomes in the future as a result of applying foresight. Feedback. We need a way to monitor the results of policy. Typically, the president will sign off on a policy. It's handed over to the bureaucracy, and that's not it's a term that I picked up when I was in government. It means the executive branch, the people who exist to execute policy in their professions, and then the people who form that policy and who made it turn to other matters. The problem here is that no policy is perfect. They are flawed deeply at the moment that they are conceived, because that's the way the world is operating. And the problem with that arrangement is that you only find out that the policies have exhausted their good points when their bad points have surfaced, and when you experience an unpleasant sensation of being involved in a crash and burn situation with a major federal objective. So we need a feedback system that would provide senior leaders with an idea of how policies are working out in practice once they have been instituted. That means that you need to identify information streams that can be monitored, define in advance what constitutes success, create trigger points in the system that would lead to review, and basically design a system that allows people who have signed off on major policies at the top of government to be made aware of indications that change is needed. Now, there have been signs of what I would call assimilation, that these ideas are percolating. We have Office of Management and Budget, which is seriously implementing the Government Performance and Results Act in an effort to align agency strategies, tie strategy to the budget, and set strategic priorities across the interagency system. You have the National Security Staff Strategy Office at the White House, which is working to unify policy planning across agencies, align budget and strategy by working more closely with OMB. And you have the ODNI National Intelligence Managers who are working on the intelligence community side of the process of trying to bring awareness of future possibilities to the table where policy is made. Future will not resemble the past, and it will not resemble the present. We're at the beginning of a new epoch that is being defined as we go along. Mark Twain is thought to have written the words, "History does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme." And so, that needs to be the motto over the door. Complexity and fast-paced change are a tremendous challenge for the nation, more so perhaps than any single individual threats, since they can interact. Anticipatory governance is practical, credible, and nonpartisan, and those of us who have endorsed it and worked on it believe that now is the time, as the new administration is instituted, to consider putting these changes into place. Now, I said that I wanted to recognize a few persons as I finish. There are many here in the room as friends, I said, but there are also people who are former students and whose work over a considerable period of time has made all the difference. These are people like Justin Zorn, Neil Potacone, Neil Soroka, David Kay, Jill Hayes, one or two others who were at the very beginning, Joanna Nicoletti, and above all I'd like to reference Evan Faber, who began as my student and has ended 5 years later, as my right arm. It's also time to let those of you who follow what I've been up to more closely than others know that Evan will be moving on, hopefully I think, to glory, but at the end of February. That saddens me greatly, but it also suggests growth, and growth is what this is all about. So I want to acknowledge that there is good reason for his presence and my acknowledgement of his work. That's it. Minutes. 20 minutes? Did it. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Barbara, for the introduction. Thank you, Leon, for asking me to come. Leon, this is a culmination of a project you've been engaged with for more years than we can count. I've known you, I think, back at least 30 years. I can't think of a more important contribution to our nation's future than being able to take the lessons of that experience, combined with those of many other people, and put them into a workable format. And indeed, a format that takes into account the real world problems. I have, in my own experience, no greater formula to offer than your holy or unholy trinity of foresight, networking, and feedback. In fact, the loop is critically valuable, and it is a set of areas where we have notably fallen down in our own government. There are many words around, including whole of government, which fit. Leon, thank you for that, and thank you for your willingness to make this into a kind of national crusade. Regardless, in fact, of whether funding is available or not, I hope you can count on me and the rest of your friends to be with you as you try to move this ahead. Leon asked me if I would give a few practical examples from my own experience of the value of his paradigm. The one I can think of that has the greatest relevance for me is Plan Columbia. In 1998, Columbia was failing. Sandy Berger and Madeleine Albright asked me if I would lead what was then called an executive committee of the National Security Council to include all the government agencies working in Colombia and see if we could come up with an answer. Peter Romero was the Assistant Secretary of the region, and Rand Beers, who was running the State Department Drugs and Crime Operation, were principals in putting together an approach which involved all three elements, although we didn't know it at the time, Leon, and they fit your paradigm. The principal one was networking. We had an opportunity to get in the room, all the people working on Colombia for, I think, the first time. And the value to me, as the leader of the effort, was they were frustrated as hell. Nobody ever asked them for their views, nobody ever paid any attention to them, and nobody ever highlighted the need to deal with Colombia. Secondly, we immediately went to Colombia and said to the Colombians, you have most of the ideas on the table, can we help you put those together in your plan for your country where we're the gap filler? And indeed, it was our own foresight in thinking about how to push this ahead using their knowledge of their own paradigms and the changing situation in their country. And what we brought to the table were two simple principles. We could work together throughout the U.S. government to fill the gaps, and we could help them understand where we thought they were falling short, particularly on the soft side of the kind of equations that they needed to combine a combination of dealing with drugs, reforming their own society, and finding a way to use the military part of the equation to supplement and support both of those rather than to make them both worse. And that worked very well. But it evolved in a different way than we expected. We ended up combining foresight, networking, and feedback with the Colombians themselves. So not only did we have networked inside the U.S. government, but we had networked across both governments. And we met monthly, and then sometimes later, about 6 times a year, in Colombia, with the Colombians around a common table, with the president of Colombia sitting on the other side. And we examined what was working, what was not working, what needed change. And in effect, feedback became foresight as part of the loop, and it was very important to us. But it was a useful and valuable approach to applying in an indirect way the brilliance of Leon's formulas and ideas, which he has now put out in a series of concrete steps that can work ahead. A final point from my side. Reform is tough inside the U.S. government. My view has been in the State Department, no secretary who is new to the department will want to address reform in her first year. She doesn't know what's going on. She's learning the process. And indeed, in the first year, there are 2 pressing problems for a secretary. Get on top of the issues, but even more important, meet the White House demands for appointment of all those worthy people who have to have jobs. Once you get those people in place, don't think about reform, because reform requires moving or getting rid of the people you've just appointed at the behest of the White House. So the idea then is, in the second year, let's do it in my final year when I really know what I'm doing. When the final year comes around, the crescendo of stuff coming over the transom has gotten so bad, and the secretary has become so tired, that he or she says, you know, I'm going to leave this to my successor. And that is the evolution of reform, particularly in the State Department. So in fact, we are on a Nordic track treadmill, working harder to get nowhere, and it is the essential requirement of the brilliance of these simple organizational and structural ideas, which can be done without money and without the Congress, that'll get us out. But we do not yet have time to move them. And so that's the box we're in. Thank you, Leon, for providing a way out. Thank you.
All right. I think we could skip straight to the discussion. I have a suggestion with the audience. It's a little early for lunch. Thank you, Leon. It's, one thing about Leon is that he just doesn't have a sense of humor. So it's been wonderful knowing you. I think at this point I'm going to stand up and be a moderator of the Q&A. And if you have a question, please maybe stand up, say briefly who you are, and then state your question, sir. And the mic will come to you.
I'm Charlie Stevenson. I teach at SAIS, but 25 years ago I was actually teaching here. Leon and Tom, you also worked, as I did, on the Project on National Security Reform, which produced kind of a beta version of what you have here. How well do you think General Jones, Tom Donilon did with those ideas, these ideas, and maybe you've already answered it, Tom, but why didn't they go farther?
Okay. Oh, hooked up. I think they did a fantastic job. I was not aware of them when I first arrived here and began to work on this. And I learned that they existed. They were, by the way, legislatively mandated and funded throughout their existence. I began to read what they were producing. It was first quality. I looked at their organization. They had a large group of people, many of them working for nothing, despite their tremendous credentials. And they were producing great stuff. The reason they didn't get to the conclusion is because they were cut off at the knees in the House appropriations process by a chairman, I believe, who thought that if this came to pass, it would undercut his authority. As simple as that, and as homey as that. And although the head of the project tried to find alternative ways to keep it floating and worked valiantly to do it, that was what it took. Had his ideas become part of an omnibus piece of legislation, we'd be well on our way towards a systemic reform. But one of the things I learned from the way this panned out is try and find another way to get there that doesn't require legislation.
I would also say that because a number of the people you mentioned were in positions of significant responsibility and themselves were converts, or if you could put it this way, leaders of the movement before they got their jobs, they soon found out the other part of the paradigm, that the daily flow of business and indeed the work of creating policy in government allows no time to deal with the question of the sort of reforms that will in effect over a period of time make you more effective, more efficient, and indeed a better policymaker. And for reasons that I don't yet fathom, but a lot having to do, particularly in national security structure, with the paucity of funding for additional personnel, they were not able to create the kind of dedicated full-time effort that had to go ahead to deal with some of that, and then to put those lessons into practice. And so, in effect, it was some of the sclerosis of the present process that tended either to allow small efforts, but not significant ones, to go ahead, but never emerge at the top of the policy heap, or indeed allowed them to be submerged through the overwhelming nature of the daily business of government, as opposed to the business, which I think is important, of looking at the future of government.
Thank you, lady, and then I'll come to you. Yes. Oh, microphone. Right.
Thank you very much. This kind of stuff is really exciting. Having been on the tangent of some of these smaller groups that discuss the nature of decision making, the interagency process, and so forth, the fundamental problem I have seen is that it's not they're not able to get beyond the flaws of the decision making process and one that can avert groupthink. And I'd be interested in knowing whether your model can overcome that, because I think that has been the fundamental problem. And the corollary of that is that many of these efforts go on, are planned so far in advance policy efforts, particularly in the military. And by the time we get to it, there's nothing you can you can't really do much. And I think that these are the two problems I find with all the different experiments haven't been able to overcome that aspect of it. So.
Ready? There's always a trajectory that runs for any new idea from outrageous to orthodox. Every idea is going to cover that trajectory somehow, even in science, where you find that yesterday's outrageous proposition becomes tomorrow's basic theory becomes overturned by some discovery later on. Knowledge is not static, it's always fluid. So you're talking about a real problem, which is how to keep people alive to the fact that in a complex universe, the one constant is surprise and change. We want certainty, we want routine, and where policy is concerned, we frequently get locked into what worked. What we need to remember is that sooner or later it won't work, and there needs to be part of that process and part of the training for people that focuses on this reality.
Maybe just to add to that, the continuum between outrageous and orthodoxy is really also matched by another continuum between practicality and theory. There's a wonderful story about the French, as suffused as they are in Cartesian logic. The principal question is, it works in practice, but can we make it work in theory? To some extent, what Leon has tried to do is to take practical experience and put it in a context that can be easily understood and applied, not to run away from the practicalities toward theoretical orthodoxy, but to try in some ways to help draw the fundamental lessons out of the areas of inattention or mistake that are there. I think to some extent our problems are groupthink, as the questioner raised. And there is an easy kind of mellowing experience to come into the room and say, yeah, we have all the answers, and here are the right things to do. So the foresight part of Leon's equation is at least the beginning of a challenge to that. I think that there is an increasing use of red teaming in the U.S. government. I'm an advocate of that, and I think that that helps us enrich foresight, but it also helps us enrich feedback. And as I said earlier, I think feedback is foresight, and to some extent it is very important to be able to do that. And I think that will help as well. I think running on the same rails because we can't get off is in a sense a part of groupthink. So the two pieces are in some ways aligned. On the other hand, I found in my experience with policy, the great issue, and it was the assistant secretaries of state and responsible for the region in the main, and those in the State Department responsible for fundamental functional issues, who had to come up with the notion that their favorite policy prescription, whenever they put it forward, wasn't working. And they had to figure out how to deal with it. And there was no fundamental organization for that except the honesty that they and their deputies and their people brought to the question. And occasionally the irritation of the policy planning staff telling you that they thought the emperor's new clothes weren't fitting very well. But you had to constantly look at that. To some extent, we have it, but we don't have it in an organized way. We don't have it in a way that functions effectively. And we have it in a way that the questioner implied is that our commitments in an emotional sense to the answers that we have devised a month ago or last year now have to be open to further questioning. And that part of the equation in the government certainly, I think, needs to be enriched and strengthened. It's part of a debate. And to some extent, in plenty of organizations, debate is not yet fully welcome.
I promised you, and then I'm going to go back to you.
Yeah, Charlie Clark with Government Executive. Could you talk a little more about what's happening now with this proposal and paper with the new administration, new term?
Well, I think I would do a bunch of bad things like crack a bottle of champagne and light up a cigar if I thought that this was number one on their agenda. Partly because if it were number one on their agenda, it would mean that a lot is right with the world that isn't at this particular moment. I think they have to settle down. Think of the fact that in addition to the cabinet level officers, the entire sub-tier of people remain to be designated and appointed and shown where the locks are to their doors and all the rest of it. It will be a good 6 months to 10 months before the administration's shakedown cruise is complete, even though at the top it's run by old hands. Those will be old hands in new configurations meeting new problems. Thing is, and I think Tom's emphasized this, that in order to get this kind of benefit, you're going to have to go the extra mile, to invest the extra effort to create this system and get it spun up and running alongside of what already exists. If we don't do this, then I think, unfortunately, our system is going to continue to lag behind the pace of change. That's deadly for a democracy. We prove our validity as a political system because of our ability to recognize what's happening, respond pragmatically to it, using democratic forms of debate. But given the velocity of change, the only way to do that is to claw back more time by anticipating sooner.
Just let me add to that, because I entirely agree with what Leon has said. There's a theory around this town that the second administration liberates the president and his cabinet and all the others to do beautiful things that they are otherwise constrained for not doing because the election requirements to get reelected were so difficult to meet that they had to, in a sense, lay low and be quiet. And I think there's some truth to this, but there's a lot of falsity. I think one of the problems is now that the next election begins the day before the current election ends. The second issue is that no president worth his salt is going in his second term to destroy the chances of his party succeeding in the next election. There is perhaps a kind of room for change in the first couple of years of the second administration, which gets squeezed out by this intense focus on elections in the United States in the last 2 years. And so Leon has picked a perfect time to end his funding and put forward his ideas. It's now. And the challenge is now.
I didn't think the funding part was so very perfect, but the rest
no. But anyway, if you're going to have to give up funding, you might as well make it hurt you out of it. But let me say that the old people who know a lot are tired, and the new people who are learning a lot are still learning a lot. So those are barriers, but they're not necessarily insuperable barriers. And so in effect, we have a kind of 2-year window, both on policy and on change, that somehow I think we need to grab onto and see whether, in fact, these kinds of things can happen. Now, Leon, you know that some of the stuff is coming osmotically. That people are, because they see the problems, maybe dissected into smaller pieces, beginning to adopt some of these approaches. First, because they're intelligent. Secondly, because they answer the call. And thirdly, because they are now unavoidable, because the drums have been beating for 5 or 6 years on the notion that's out there that this particular study represents perhaps an epitome of, because it's an attempt to try to find answers to the problems without having to go through the difficult course of congressional approval and new money.
And presidential inspiration.
Yeah. Well, we have time for that.
Yes, we do. Let's hope that we see it happen.
In the interest of gender equality, I'm going to pick a woman, and then maybe another one. That would be Mary.
My name is Claudia Farris. I am finishing up a PhD in public policy at George Mason. My thesis is in complexity science. I want to say that there is an answer in chaos theory to the question of why you're experiencing this acceleration, chaos theory and bifurcation. Okay, and we can talk about that offline, but for the academics in the room, that's an important point. The question is that there is a difference between a natural network or an internal network and an externally structured network. I wonder if your work recognizes that distinction and if there is a way for you to capture in your system the existing internal network, internally controlled behavior that the various systems that you're operating with do, whether you want them to do it or not. Engage that network in your problem-solving approaches.
It's impossible to design a perfect network or perfect protocol for how elements of a complicated system interact. Believe me, that's a subordinate clause. More is coming. God bless the semicolon. It's equally impossible to write a perfect treaty for reasons that are probably related, because language does not allow the degree of precision that enables a formal agreement to embrace all contingencies. Right? And so even something that has been worked on meticulously by teams of lawyers and negotiators and translators and whatnot will be found not to meet contingencies, not because either side is trying to cheat necessarily, but because they inevitably have not foreseen and cannot foresee what is coming in its entirety. So in any arrangement that purports to be a network, there needs to be a design that stresses flexibility and the possibility for serendipity. It isn't like organizing Wilhelmian Germany the way the Kaiser was said to have wanted it. Look at the clock and know what was being taught in every grade and every course throughout the German Empire. It is much more trying to organize according to what the principles of complexity tell you to expect. It would take a much longer response to get there, and I'm only approximating what I think you mean by language that has technical meaning for you. But the fact is there are formal structures, and these have to be leavened by informal parts of the system. And there has to still be accountability. If you get people hiving away and making policy decisions in closed rooms and not telling the other participants about it, you're going to crash. On the other hand, if you have a system which allows issues to be moved with discipline between an informal venue for exploration and discussion and a formal venue for analysis, policy, and action, then you've got something going. And the one thing I want to point out is that we experimented with this in these commissions during the Clinton-Gore administration. My former deputy is sitting in the room. He bears the scars of this experimentation. But it taught us that it was possible to achieve greater coherence across the normal divisions of government. Thanks.
Maybe I just could add, having grown up for a few years in the Navy, which pioneered task forces for its operations, and then for too many years in the State Department, where in fact the notion that you had to reach out to a large part of the rest of the government because you were fooling around with their business and foreign affairs meant that you have a combination of two things. Informal task forces, but I think increasingly a notion that task forces or networks, if they were put together, had to have defined purposes. That I think too much effort has been expended on what one would call a monthly meeting of everybody concerned, in which there was show and tell, but no real structure for either attacking a problem or getting it done. And I think that's given task forces or networks a bad name. There is probably also the notion that if you get too many working in a common area, you'll overstress the participants. They won't know in any one day which one they're working on. They may well have too much to do, and you need to watch that very carefully. So my view is at least networking ought to start with what one would call important second-order questions that need to be addressed by the bureaucracy that rarely, if ever, poke their heads to the Deputies Committee, but if they are not covered, are going to. And that they need to have a discrete leader, and they need to have empowerment of the leader. And if they involve a lot of money, you need quickly to decide the issue of whether, in fact, you're going to go the feckless route of trying to raid agency budgets, or whether you're going to rally the troops because you're prepared to go for a SUP or some other funding arrangement which doesn't require them to go to their cabinet secretary and say, we've been asked to give a piece of our budget which we haven't allocated. That means, in fact, we need to think about supporting this process over time with adequate funding arrangements which can be responsive to changing situations. And our current budgets are made up 2 years ahead of implementation, and how could they possibly know precisely what's going to be required 2 years later, particularly in terms of challenges in a changing world of foreign policy and security, to say nothing of disease and other kinds of natural catastrophes.
Timing is of the essence when you are trying to run a system on cybernetic principles. Is if you come up with an adjustment which is out of sync with the pace of the change that you're dealing with, it may produce results that are worse than what you were struggling with beforehand. You have to have the nimbleness to recognize what is happening and the capacity for strategic response, which means the ability to bring a response together with a problem at a point where it actually affects it and has the consequences that you're trying to design into the system. Now, the capacity for strategic action is a whole other subject in our government, and it's a very serious problem.
I have time for only one more question, and I'm giving it to Mary, I'm afraid.
Mary Yates, I've been a fan of this. Mary Yates, I've been a fan of this project since I've known about it with both Leon and Evan, and have had Tom mentor me my entire career, I think. I want to make a comment because I was at the White House. Jim Jones brought me in to head the strategic planning cell. And it was partly because in my career trajectory, I was the first civilian ever given the deputy command in a military command at the Africa Command. And he understood interagency. He understood how things had to run differently in government. We did the president. He had done the presidential directive, to begin a different way of assembling. They got rid of the Homeland Security Council staff. We all became national security staff. The vision was there for change, and I think it's as you said. They were dedicated. Now, what happened to this small staff of 4 people and myself of trying to do strategic thinking and attach it to the Deputies Committee? It is very, very difficult, just as you said. In fact, the last things you were talking about, Tom, I think really make a lot of sense. And we actually got an IPC. The IPC is the committee level below the Deputies Committee that I ran, and we looked at the issue, the national security challenge of water, of global commons, and we sat there in an interagency meeting and discussed these. What happened to those papers, especially the one on water, where we had some very good recommendations? I got it to Dennis McDonough. I'm not sure it ever got read because of all of the, stuff coming over the transom. So I think that, one thing, and one reason I'm here is because I really believe in foresight. And you go and you see what the Singaporeans have done for their nation by implementing and integrating foresight. We can do this as a nation. We've got to have a champion inside the White House. I agree the first 2 years is the time for this to happen. And I even think the idea, if you've got the individual that you talk about, Tom, if you, in the Deputies Committee meeting, if they could red team it and you could put the page in there, or you get your 2 bullets or something like that in the page memo, that said, and what would happen 20 or 30 years from now, or whatever, years you want to put on it, have we thought about these unintended consequences if we take this policy decision, vis-a-vis Sudan, vis-a-vis this or something else? So at least the deputies sitting around the committee think, somebody else has done the thinking for them, and you condense it and put it in there. Just like I think we've got to get that back in on the budget, because we too many times make policy decisions in a budget vacuum. Anyway, I'll stop talking, but I'm here in great support of what you do.
Thank you, Mary. Would you like to respond, Professor Fuerth or Ambassador
I agree
Pickering?
entirely. Thanks.
Same.
I think it's a great note to end on. Please join me in thanking Professor Fuerth and Ambassador Pickering.